And with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Sheila Jeffreys.
Today, what I'm going to be doing is talking about evidence I did as an expert witness to the Lesbian Action Group case in Melbourne at the beginning of this month. Only a part of it because it was a very long statement. So I was asked to be an expert witness in the Lesbian Action Group case before the Australian Administrative Tribunal, Administrative Appeals Tribunal. The case concerned the right of lesbians to meet without the presence of men who pretend to be lesbians. Carol Ann from the Lesbian Action Group talked about the background of the case recently on Feminist Question Time, and so a lot of you will have heard that. She explained that her group had asked for an exemption last year from the Human Rights Commission to be permitted to hold meetings at the Pride Centre in Melbourne for lesbians only. The Commission decided that the transvestites could not be discriminated against because they could be lesbians just like women could. The case was appealed, and I appeared online to be interrogated by the barrister for the other side in relation to the witness statement that I had provided. Now, I wrote the witness statement, so it might sound rather strange, in the form of responses to questions that the barrister for the Lesbian Action Group, Lee Howard, sent me. They were questions that fitted with the case he wanted to make. By the way, the solicitor in this case was Anna Kerr at the Feminist Legal Centre in Sydney, who those of us from WDI will already know quite well. So in the first section of the questions that he asked me, he asked what lesbian feminism was about, a bit about its history and principles. Now, he thought that there was a case to be made that a group with a particular politics, lesbian feminists, was being discriminated against by not being allowed to meet to promote their purposes. As he understood it, the Human Rights Commission that had denied this request saw no particular meaning in lesbians. In fact, they had absolutely no idea what lesbians were, which is why they thought that men could be lesbians, and he thought that this needed to be challenged. So at the beginning of the report, I explained the basic principles of lesbian feminism, and I'm really only going to go through them very, very, very superficially here because it's not the main part of what I want to talk about. I explained that the first principle, which nobody needed to talk about back in the day when lesbian feminism was created in the 70s and 80s, the first point was that actually lesbians are women. We didn't need to say that back then because there were not men pretending to be lesbians trying to get into our meetings and so on. They mostly pretended to be lesbians when they were sexually exercised in their bathrooms, for instance, not out in public and trying to get into our spaces. The second point I made was that lesbianism is political. It's about feminist revolution and is a form of resistance. I explained that lesbian feminism is separatist, believing in the fundamental importance of women and lesbian-only space. I explained that lesbian feminists do not think that they are the victims of biology, but that women can choose to be lesbians. I explained that lesbian feminists, like radical feminists in general, see the personal as political idea, i.e., that the experience of everyday life is constructed by male domination. And I explained that lesbian feminists reject hierarchy and strive for the eroticizing of equality in their relationships. I said a great deal more than this about all of that, but I'm not going to go into it today. But that was the basis. Today, I'm going to concentrate on the argument that I made about why lesbians should be able to exclude men in general, and in particular, those who claim to be lesbians. In fact, the barrister for the other side asked me nothing about lesbian feminism or lesbianism. So actually, nobody had any interest in that in the courtroom. So the next thing that the barrister wanted to know was why the Lesbian Action Group wanted to organize and associate with what he called members of the female sex who are lesbians and not with members of the male sex, including those who identified with the female gender, as he called it, as a lesbian. I explained that before the end of the 20th century, lesbians and feminists regularly held meetings that were women only, with little need to consider whether they might meet opposition. Men who claim to be lesbians and enter women's and lesbian spaces are a fairly new phenomenon. In the 70s and 80s, in London, for instance, there were only one or two who tried to get into women's and lesbian spaces, and they were given short shrift. Both homosexual and heterosexual men may say they have female gender identities, but gay men who have gender identities do not claim to be lesbians, not surprisingly. Their sexual orientation is towards men, so they are not the ones seeking to enter women's or lesbians' events or meetings for sexual purposes. Now, the idea that men can become women and lesbians reached a peak of its influence in the 2010s, when the feminist movement was not strong, and when the majority, both of policymakers and the public, have been bamboozled into thinking that both adults and children could change their so-called gender, which was understood as sex. So now I want to move on to specifically why men want to be in lesbian spaces, since, of course, they are not lesbians. Now, the inclusion of men, whatever their identity, in lesbian spaces is a problem because their only reason for being in such spaces are likely to be affirmation or sexual satisfaction. Whilst men without gender identities may seek to enter women's and lesbian spaces for sexual satisfaction, the demand for affirmation is a new problem that relates only to men who claim to be women or lesbians. Men with gender identities seek affirmation from women to make themselves feel real. There is a considerable and increasing body of evidence that men who claim to be women are likely to become abusive and even physically violent towards women who will not accept their identities and persist in saying that they are, in fact, men. Lesbian feminists are very unlikely to accept that men who say they are really women and lesbians actually are so. As a result, when men with gender identities enter women's spaces, lesbians may find themselves under pressure to engage in the man's game of make-believe and pretend they think he is a woman, which is a form of compelled speech and behavior. And if they refuse to do this, they may risk having to deal with aggression. Now, the problem is, of course, I needed to find evidence to suggest that men would become violent in these situations. There is a complete scarcity of academic research on the violence of men who transgender towards women and lesbians, because, of course, universities in general do not want to have that sort of research engaged in. We really don't have a lot of information. But what I'm going to say next really is what I've managed to pull together, and it's something that we might need to do in other cases of this kind, where we need to talk about why it is unsuitable to have these men pretending to be lesbians in our spaces. So it was not easy to find the information. So the evidence, of what can happen when men who claim to be women find that women and lesbians will not affirm them. I can't look at all of it because there's quite a few cases in newspapers and online, which I've been looking at. In some instances, the violence takes the form of trans activists punching women, usually punching in the face, at rallies where women reject the claim that these men are women. At a rally in 2017 in London, where women assembled to challenge the notion that men can become women, a trans activist attacked a protester and stole her camera, and he was later found guilty of assault. In a rally along similar lines in Wellington, New Zealand in 2023, a 71-year-old woman was punched repeatedly in the face by a man and suffered serious injury, and the perpetrator was found guilty of assault. So these are sort of well-documented cases. There was an example of a man with a gender identity attacking a woman who would not affirm him in Melbourne in 2022. The attacker was sentenced in April 2023 for the assault. A woman attending a punk music event was shoulder barged by someone she saw as a man. When she challenged the man, she addressed him as male, and he and his companions took exception to her pronoun use. She understands that a mutual acquaintance had informed the man of her gender-critical views. As she walked away, he assaulted her from behind, knocking her to the ground with such force that her shoulder was shattered and her arm broken, leaving her with a permanent injury. Trans activists can go further than simply beating up women. In 2016, in the US, the celebrated trans activist Dana Rivers killed 2 lesbians and their 19-year-old adopted son. He shot them all with a handgun and then stabbed one of the lesbians 47 times. He was a leader of Camp Trans, which was established outside the Michigan Women's Music Festival. The festival had a women-only policy, and the trans activists tried to change that by entering the site and harassing women. It was a hugely important cultural institution for US lesbians and a center of community. But it ended in 2015 after a couple of decades of harassment by men with gender identities. The 2 lesbians that Rivers killed were regular attendees at the festival, though this was not remarked upon in the legal proceedings. There is another connection between Rivers and the issue of women's spaces. He elected to be sent to a women's prison, where female inmates report that he leers at women and makes them feel extremely uncomfortable. Women who fail to affirm the gender identities of men are likely to receive very considerable verbal abuse. The TERF is a slur website, documents the abuse, harassment, and misogyny of transgender politics. Men with gender identities use abuse in memes such as TERFs can choke on my girl dick. Now, interestingly, when I was in the tribunal, the barrister on the opposing side, who asked me no questions about lesbians, directed her question to trying to discredit what I had to say about transvestites and their violence towards women. At this point in my ovariumony, I don't like the word testimony because, of course, that's based on having testes, so I prefer not to use that. So in my ovariumony, she asked why I assumed that it was men who had sent the abuse relating to sucking dicks. And I replied that this was really common sense. My ovariumony continued, explaining that the word TERF is used against feminists who are critical of gender identity and so on, which we all know about. Now, the imagery that trans activists display against TERFs who protest transgender politics can include TERFs hung from trees, the carrying of baseball bats with nails in, alongside T-shirts with extremely misogynist slogans such as "I punch TERFs" on a background of blood spatter. Posters may carry images of hanged women with the slogan "Dead TERFs" or "Stab your local TERF." This kind of abuse is regularly sent online to any women who publicly fail to affirm that men can become women. The lesbian feminists who set up and attend lesbian and women-only events are likely to be aware of this extreme antagonism towards them and want a place of safety to which men do not have access. And that might seem fairly straightforward into response of this. Those politicians who have publicly refused to affirm men with gender identities, and there are some in this country, have received serious abuse. The lesbian former MP Joanna Cherry, who lost her seat at the last election in the UK, for instance, had to get a police escort because of threats to her safety in 2019. And she states, "Many women inside and without this chamber, such as myself, have received terrible abuse on Twitter, including repeated threats to shoot us if we do not shut the FUCK up." Now, another problem with these men is likely to be the sexual harassment of lesbians. In recent years, there's been increasing pressure from men with gender identities to persuade lesbians that they should change their sexual orientation, i.e. cease to be lesbians, in order to allow such men sexual access. In the transgender community, the term developed to describe what is seen as an unjustified setting of sexual boundaries by lesbians is the cotton ceiling, referring to the barrier that underwear presents to the penis. It references the glass ceiling, the barrier that women experience in gaining advancement in their careers. There's now a growing recognition in the media and in the lesbian community of the harm and distress suffered by lesbians when men with female gender identities seek to enter their spaces such as online dating apps, and pressure them for sexual access. This increasing problem was clear as early as 2011, when a workshop bearing the name Cotton Sealing was organized in the US. Since then, it has gained increasing currency in the media and in the international network of men with female gender identities. In fact, amazingly, cotton sealing is written about as if it's something we all know about and is a serious problem. That's kind of extraordinary when you look it up. Now, men with gender identities write in many different media, from academic journals to online outlets, about how lesbians are abusive and discriminatory for thinking that genitals matter and that prioritizing female partners is reasonable. Lesbians who will not have sex with these men are called transphobic, and this kind of pressure is felt by the lesbians who are affected as distressing and abusive. Now, this is clear in the 2019 research by Angela Wild, which some of you, I hope, have looked at. She sent out questionnaires to lesbian organizations which asked women for information about their interactions with men who claim to be lesbians. The 80 respondents reported a range of forms of abuse and harassment for questioning the idea that men can become lesbians or just stating they were lesbians. Respondents reported experiences including verbal abuse, death and rape threats, pressure to commit suicide, threats of physical or sexual violence, threats to kill family members, receiving trans women nudes, threats of doxing, actual online doxing, including exposure of their name, picture and home address, threats of exposure to employers. Most of the abuse came in response to lesbians questioning the idea that a man can be a lesbian, i.e. failing to affirm. While most of this intimidation happened online, many women also reported offline threats, such as the following. 2 respondents were threatened at their place of work and 1 lost her job. The woman's employer was repeatedly contacted with attempts to have her dismissed. 2 respondents were subjected to intimidating behavior from trans women at lesbian events. And a 70-year-old woman reported being physically threatened and forced out of a group by a physically intimidating trans woman. The respondents explained that in many places they had to meet underground because it was impossible to set up women-only spaces. They said that dating apps for lesbians were hard to use because they contained so many men, many of whom did not even shave off their beards whilst pretending to be lesbians. A majority of respondents reported being psychologically pressured online to accept a man with a gender identity as a partner. They reported being told that they were worse than rapists if they don't date trans women, and that not dating trans women is akin to racism. So the pressure on women, and particularly younger women, to have anything to do with these men is very strong. The need for women and lesbians to have single-sex spaces is supported by the research presented by feminist lawyers and campaigners against the accommodation of men with gender identities in women's prisons. The research suggests that men with gender identities do not become like women in terms of their behavior, but are likely to retain the pattern of criminally violent behavior and the psychiatric morbidity characteristic of other biological males, called male pattern violence. This was found in a follow-up study of men who had been sex reassigned in Sweden between 1973 and 2003. It concluded that these men retained a male pattern of criminality and violent behavior. Their vaunted female gender identities did not cause them to behave in ways similar to those of women. This was also the finding of research in the UK into the characteristics of men with gender identities who end up in prison. In their evidence submitted to the Women's Equality Committee of the UK Parliament in 2021, 3 professors used official Ministry of Justice statistics to show that of the 129 men who were transgender prisoners in March to April 2019, 76 or 58% of offenders were of sex offenders. There was an extremely high discrepancy between this percentage of sex offenders and that found amongst all women prisoners. 125 sex offenders out of 3,812, or 3.3%, and out of the total of Men, on the other hand, 16.8% were sex offenders. This evidence was presented in support of the exclusion of men with gender identities from women's prisons, where it could be argued women are particularly vulnerable to male violence. However, there are implications from this evidence that men with gender identities pose similar risks of violence and sexual assault to other men in general, which highlights the need for lesbians, who may present a particular attraction to certain men, have women-only spaces available of them. All of the evidence above provides good grounds for the needs of the Lesbian Action Group to be able to organise lesbian-only events. Now, I was then asked to talk about the conflicts in political interest between lesbian members of the female sex and members of the male sex who identify with the female gender as lesbians. Men with female gender identities have the political interest of seeking to be affirmed as women and as lesbians and enter lesbian spaces and community. Lesbian feminists, on the other hand, want their spaces to be for women only. The men's political demands stem from their sexual paraphilia of transvestism. And there, I have looked at and written about the pornography that's directed specifically at these men, which shows what their particular paraphilia is about, what it is that excites them. And my favorite title in that pornography is always Gender Swapped by Aliens. I'm rather fond of that one. And this pornography is usually categorized under the subgenres sissification and bimbofication. The story is about status reduction. Men are not only reduced to the status of women, but to women in what are seen as lowly servicing occupations, such as secretary, in which they are sexually exposed and assaulted, activities which are aimed at the ejaculation of the male audience. For instance, the covers of these little pornography novels will have a woman on hands and knees in front of a filing cabinet with high-heeled shoes, and the man in the story gets transformed into her. A more recent form of transgender porn takes the form of what's usually called sissy hypno, in which male viewers are encouraged through sexual stimulation to think of themselves as really being women. And it does seem likely that the apparent boom in men claiming female gender identities is related to the boom in the humiliation pornography that serves and trains them. And it's an important part of gender identity ideology to argue that men's adoption of female gender identities is nothing to do with sex, but about an innate condition. And admitting the sexual motivation is seen as discrediting the realness of their enterprise. When these men are sexually orientated towards women, they are likely to claim to be lesbians, though their sexual orientation does not change. I mean, what was interesting for me was that because their barrister started asking me, basically, how could I say anything? What basis did I have for saying any of this was sexual and so on? I was given the opportunity, which was very useful for me, to start talking about autogynephilia and all of this, the desire for humiliation and so on. And in fact, I did talk about these men seeking used tampons to put up their bottoms and so on, which seems to have created a little bit of a stir, because as quite a lot of women have told me since then, that's unusual. In courtrooms, people don't say that. I have to say also that very generally in courtrooms, nobody would ever say anything about the sex. You're really not supposed to do that. So lesbians want women-only spaces so that they can philosophize and socialize with other lesbians, women like themselves. But the reasons for not wanting the transvestites or autogynephiles in lesbian spaces go beyond this. There's much evidence to suggest that these men will have a prurient interest in lesbians and seek to pursue this interest in ways that will cause distress and disturbance to the women present. There's a long history of the production of so-called lesbian pornography for heterosexual men who are sexually excited by the idea of sexually using women who are not sexually interested in them. In other words, pressure to do what they do not wish to do. It's a problem for lesbians that men who are sexually interested in them may try to enter their spaces generally. The major online pornography website, Pornhub, reports that lesbian pornography is the most popular variety. This suggests that men are the main consumers of lesbian porn, since women in general are considerably less likely to consume pornography than men. Since the earliest times in which lesbians have sought to organize socially and politically, heterosexual men have sought to get access to them for sexual purposes. For instance, Diana Chapman, one of the founders of an early lesbian organization in London, the Minorities Research Group, in 1963, remarked on how shocked these lesbians were 60 years ago to discover that heterosexual men would harass lesbians for sex. She said, "We hadn't realized there was this interest in lesbianism as pornography, and that we found shocking. We'd have men knocking at the door and ringing up. So the very first time there was a lesbian organization, they were pestered and harassed by men for sexual excitement." Today, the same behavior may be justified by the men saying that they are lesbians because they have female gender identities. There are other points of conflict between lesbians and the men who claim to be lesbians. One is the use of the word lesbian by these men. If men can be lesbians, then the category lesbian is exploded. It no longer makes sense. As Joanna Cherry explains, without sex, there can be no same-sex attraction. That is why lesbians like me fight the replacement of the biological reality of sex with the nebulous concept of gender. Lesbians cannot fight for their rights once they no longer exist as a discrete category. So, in summing up, I'm going to talk about the risks in general that Lesbian Action Group faces when conducting public events that permit the attendance of members of the male sex who identify with the female gender as a lesbian. And remember, this is only a very short piece of this witness statement that I'm talking about here. There were many other subjects covered. So the risks I suggest cover the following: interruptions, diversions, and disruptions. One risk is that lesbians who attend will be unable to advance their objectives because the men will disrupt, interrupt, and divert the proceedings, so that lesbians will be unable to develop their specific social, cultural, and political interests. The men, for instance, are unlikely to have the same reaction to a recitation of lesbian love poetry and may make the lesbian performers and audience deeply uncomfortable. The men are unlikely to react positively to the way in which lesbians describe male behavior as they create lesbian feminist theory. Another risk is the prevention of the development of lesbian-specific politics and culture. So another risk is that it will be very difficult for lesbians to create lesbian-specific culture and theory when men in the room throw their very lesbian existence into doubt by telling them that men can be lesbians, an idea which suggests lesbians do not really exist. The creation of lesbian theory, poetry, literature, theatre cannot take place if there is profound uncertainty as to whether the category of lesbian, women who love women, really has any meaning. Another risk is the risk of lesbian exclusion. This is that the presence of men with all the problems they bring will lead to lesbian exclusion. Lesbianist spaces will become the province of men with lesbian identities. Lesbians, perhaps particularly young ones, who particularly need the consolations of lesbian community to build their own lesbian pride, may simply not come back to venues that include men. This means that there will be a permanent obstacle to the recreation, which we're trying to do right now, of lesbian community. Another risk is violence against lesbians. This risk is that such men will become aggressive and abusive when lesbians refuse to affirm their fantasy identities. There is evidence to show that when men assume fantasy lesbian identities, They retain their propensity for male pattern violence, and good evidence to suggest that men who support the notion of gender identities do become aggressive to women and lesbians who question this. Serious violence and abuse have been experienced against gender-critical female members of parliament, female protesters who say that men cannot become women, women and feminists who are known to be sceptical of men's identities. There's no way that women running or attending lesbian venues can know which men will be violent and which ones will not. Another risk is the risk of sexual harassment. This risk is that these men will engage in sexual harassment, seeking to pressure lesbians for sex. There is already a good deal of evidence that heterosexual men are excited by the idea of using lesbians sexually. They are creating problems on lesbian dating apps. They've created problems for lesbian organizations. It is not a purpose of the creation of lesbian spaces to afford men sexual excitement. Men's sexual attentions create fear and distress and prevent the enjoyment by lesbians of their ordinary rights to associate and express their opinions. So all of these risks make it difficult, if not impossible, for lesbian feminists to achieve their political, social, and cultural purposes. So basically that was the summing up. And we shall not know, I know it all seems just crazy, doesn't it? It just seems absolutely crazy that one has to say any of these things, but we do. It seems that the man running the tribunal, who is the one who will make the decisions about it, quite liked what I was saying, and when I was being interrupted by the barrister for the other side, a couple of times told her off. So this might be a good sign, but we really have no idea of what the outcome will be for a couple of months. Okay, so that's all for now.